Hello, sinners and salt miners. My name is Skyen, and hey, you ever feel grief? Like you ever feel the core of yourself convulse from the constrictions of inevitable mortality and the hollowness of loss? Because I do sometimes, and I've been wondering, how do you show that? Like in a picture, how do you take what that feels like inside and make it visible outside? Art that depicts an emotion as its main subject is, in many ways, kind of a dime a dozen. Emotions are universal experiences, and human beings are grateful audiences. Show us a circle with 2 dots and a curved line, and we will see happiness. More complicated feelings like grief, though, are interesting because grief is not quite the same thing as just sadness. Sadness is a component of it for sure, but showing a sad face isn't enough to really communicate what grief feels like. Grief comes with anger, with emptiness. It comes with loneliness and exhaustion and a dozen other complex and multifaceted feelings that all intermix and grind against each other. That's part of why it can be so overwhelming. So, in this video, I want to look at some art about grief, basically. I don't really have a more elaborate premise for the video. I just want to share this fascination that I have, and hopefully show you some art that you might find compelling in the process. So if that sounds good to you, stick around, and let's get into it. One of the classic depictions of grief is the pieta. It's a traditional subject in Christian art, the Virgin Mary weeping over the body of Christ after he's taken down from the cross. Pietas are often beautiful, but in their most traditional forms, I also think they tend to be a little bit, boring, frankly. Being religious art, they are often concerned with beautifying and glorifying their holy subjects, and as such, the depictions of grief that we get from pietas are often a little bit, bloodless, as it were. Like, you can't show the Holy Virgin Mary crying snot out of her nose and sobbing so hard it makes her drool. That would come across as blasphemy, as some kind of caricature or mockery of her pain. No, she has to represent innocence, devotion, and boundless immaculate virtue, and so therefore she must be beautiful. Take, for example, this sculpture. It's from around 1616 by the sculptor Gregorio Fernandez, and he has Mary reaching up and looking to the heavens as though asking God, why have you taken my son from me, as she cradles Christ in her arms? But the gesture here, to me, reads more theatrical, frankly, than despairing. There's not one crease of pain on that perfect face, or even any of the blushing that comes from crying. She is an immaculately posed, perfect, holy saint, a divinity, not a person. It's much the same story in this painting from 1599 by Annabel Carracci. Mary here looks sad, but more in a way that would suggest that her friends forgot her birthday or that she just broke her favorite coffee mug, rather than, oh God, the Romans have murdered my child. And this dissonance between the putative subject and the depiction can sometimes get a little funny. Pietro Perugino's Pieta from 1490 has everyone, including Jesus, the corpse, looking less like they're caught in a moment of grave religious significance and more like their dad is just out of frame making them pose for a really annoying novelty family photo. Mary looks bored. This guy is definitely thinking about his lunch order, and the other figure in the foreground here is giving serious side-eye to the photographer. He just looks so very done. Around 1545, the painter Bronzino paints this scene, which has Mary staring at Jesus in a way that reads to me more like disapproval than sorrow, almost as though she's a little bit annoyed that her son has chosen to die in so dramatic a manner. The other figures in the painting likewise don't really look like they're all that devastated by the death of the Savior. It's more like Jesus did too many vodka shots and passed out at a party, and now everyone else is exasperated that they have to carry his drunk ass to a couch to sleep it off. My favorite character is this person at the edge of the painting who's looking out of the frame and sort of pointing at Jesus with a wine glass in their hand, almost as though to ask, hey, is he okay? Should we call someone? Pietas obviously have a different significance to devout believers. Not being Christian myself, I don't bring any reverence difference to my understanding of this scene. And art of the Pieta isn't just meant to be pretty or look good, it often has a communication function, being used as part of religious teaching, or it's meant to solidify the social standing of whatever wealthy patron commissioned its creation. Art is never just the product of an artist's imagination. There's always a material context. And I will say, I do like this Pieta from 1876 by William Adolphe Bouguereau. Here, Mary is surrounded by this crowd of perfect smooth-skinned angels who are somewhat overacting their emotions, to be honest. They almost look a little bit sarcastic the way that they're emoting. But then we look at Mary herself, and her face is in shadow from her hood, and she has deep red bags under her eyes. And as she cradles her son, she looks up and away from him, almost as though she's contemplating something or experiencing a memory, or perhaps as though she's quietly cursing God for the suffering that he's putting her through. And I love the gesture of that tension under her lip. It's like we've caught her right as she's on the brink of breaking down into sobs or letting out a wail. She's holding something back here, I think. There's sorrow in her expression here, but also despair, and more than a little bit of anger. And the colors here are a little bit unusual, because blue is usually the color of Mary. Specifically, her color is bright, rich ultramarine, which was once one of the most expensive pigments that money could buy. It's a color that has become synonymous with her purity, her innocence, her devotion, and being the bright blue of the sky and the boundless ocean, it inevitably feels optimistic and alive. But instead, Bouguereau has her clad in a deep, dark black, the color of darkness, the color of mourning. And surrounding her, there is a void-like blackness that also adds a lot of emotional weight to the image. Her son's dead and pallid skin shines like a beacon in this darkness, but Mary is retreating into it. And even though she's surrounded by those vamping angels, even though the frame is theoretically very crowded, in the center of that darkness, Mary looks lonely, isolated. Whatever hymns and laments the angels may be singing, I don't think that she can hear them. There is a dark, dead space between her and heaven now. And yeah, grief can definitely feel like that. Staying with the religious imagery, here's St. Peter. He's depicted here by Pompeo Battoni in the early 1740s, and I really like this painting. Peter himself is idealized, of course, as saints usually are. He's depicted with a gorgeous head of hair and wearing all of that sumptuous, rich fabric. But it's the posture and the expression here that does it for me. He's sitting, leaning over a table with his book and his keys in one hand and his head in the other as he cries and stares up and away towards heaven. He's feeling grief here, but it is a pensive grief, a reflective one. It's the grief of remembering sorrows that are long past, but which you still feel keenly. And we know exactly which sorrows they are, too, because in the shadows there behind him, looming like a dark spirit, is the rooster. Peter is remembering his denials of Christ, his lowest moment of cowardice, when he betrayed the person to whom he had pledged his closest and most intimate loyalty. So there are tears lingering under his eyes and the red-rimmed puffiness of weeping. Peter here is an old man stuck in a reverie, haunted by a shame that he has worked all of his life to do penance for. And this hits for me because while I generally can't relate to the divine perfection of saints and martyrs that dominates a lot of religious art, and while I have never suffered the religious torment of denying your Savior, I have betrayed a friend once. I have been a coward too. And the shadow of that, the haunting of it, it never really goes away. In my moments of contemplation, I rarely look as dignified as the saint does here, but I do resonate with what he's feeling. But okay, enough about saints and divinities. Let's turn to the other side of the coin. Here's an image that you probably know already. Alexandra Cabanel's Fallen Angel from 1847. This image is commonly interpreted to be a picture of anger, of fury, and of injured, outraged pride because it depicts Lucifer in the aftermath of his fall. You see choirs of angels fade away from him there in the sky as he sits against this naked rock with only a wilted briar for company, alone on the barren earth and cast out of heaven. But grief often comes with anger, and quite a lot of it, and I see grief in Lucifer's famous expression here. His eyes are wet, and the lower lid is thick as though it's been swollen with tears, and indeed, a single tear is rolling down dramatically from the inside corner of his eye. He's angry, but I think also in despair over what he has lost. He has been closed away from heaven and from the presence of God, which is the deepest punishment and abandonment an angel can possibly feel. It's not hard to see why people gravitate towards this kind of intense emotional expression. Lucifer's hurt and outrage here is a feeling which is keenly shared by just about anyone who has experienced this total sense of rejection by the world. It is not as rare a feeling as it should be. Still, today we reject people for the crime of being born in the wrong body, for having the wrong identity, or falling in love with the wrong person. In short, we condemn people for having too much pride. Lucifer was given his nature by God and then punished for acting in accordance with it, and this he is told to accept as justice. For all that he is the devil, normally so associated with power, Lucifer here is a picture of the grief and loneliness of the outcast. But iconic and beloved as this depiction is, it doesn't 100% land for me. There's a posture and perfection to Lucifer's body here, which I think undercuts the intensity of what he's supposed to be feeling. The figure here looks perhaps a little bit too much like the model that Cabanel probably had posing for it. Bodies racked with grief and anger rarely flex their muscles quite so picture-perfectly. They are rarely so immaculately posed and postured. Cabanel here has captured the core of something raw and real, but I don't think he's quite nailed the visceral physicality of this kind of emotional experience. Like that sculpture of the Pieta we looked at the start of the video, this, to me, feels a bit like stage acting. Lucifer here, though, does give me an excuse to talk about Arcane. In the climactic moment of the first arc of the show, as Powder disintegrates into her horror and shame and rejection and falls into Silco's arms, we are treated to two expressions which I think carry on something of what Cabanel was trying to explore. First, there is Silco's determined fury as he wraps his arms around his new daughter, the way his gaze is fixed into the distance. His grief has long since resolved into spiteful determination. He has no more tears to shed, but I see something of Lucifer in him in this moment, something of that rage that comes from betrayal. Second, there is Powder. Her eye here has all the same outraged frustration and pain that Cabanel's fallen angel is putting on display. But look at that red and bloodshot tinge in her eye, those folded creases in the skin, the oily weight of it all. She has disheveled hair falling around her face in clumps and strands, and the burning orange light of a fire reflected like a torch in her pupil. Where Cabanel has rendered his subject in marble-like angelic perfection, Arcane gets into the grease and the dirt of this kind of dejected, rageful grieving. It comes with a lot of snot and stains and tears. It comes with swollen skin and bruised knuckles, and a fist which is clenched. But okay, that is a lot of divine fury and big explosive feelings. What about grief which is less obviously dramatic? Like, for example, this. This is a piece called Inconsolable Grief by the Russian painter Ivan Nikolaevich Kramskoy, painted in 1884. The title, of course, tells us what the subject is experiencing, but we have to infer the why of it. The stark black dress that she's wearing tells us that she's probably in mourning, and the wreath and the white fabric and the many flowers at her side kinda do look like the aftermath and detritus of a wake or a burial. So it's an image of a bereavement, and the emptiness that follows when the rituals of laying the dead to rest are done. Look at her face, with that handkerchief held impassively over her mouth. Look at the way her arm just hangs limply at her side. She doesn't look angry or in the throes of sorrow, or even really that sad as such, at least not in a way that implies she's about to cry. She just looks tired, exhausted. She looks empty of feeling, which is heightened by that dead ashen gray of the wall right behind her. It seems an intentional decision to empty her immediate background like that. The apartment is mostly quite colorful and sumptuous. It's full of fine fabric and expensive objects. But behind her, behind that dead 1,000-yard stare, it's just this sparse, gray nothing. Like Mary in Bouguereau's Pieta, she looks lonely and isolated in a room that's otherwise overcrowded with things, with evidence of life. Between the haggard look of her skin, the hair messed up and undone, the empty gaze looking at nothing, and that utterly impassive posture, you sense the lowering haze of a deep and despairing depression. This is the numbness of grief, and the emptiness that it leaves with you. Otto Hesselbom was a Swedish painter in the late 19th century. He was a landscape painter, mostly, building these big, expressive, and romantic depictions of the Swedish countryside, which showcase an interesting mix of flat color surfaces with a real command of light and reflection. He was also a pastor, and probably quite intimately familiar with the grief that follows a burial. And that might be the experience that he drew on to paint this Christmas Eve at the Grave from 1896. We don't know whose grave the figure is weeping at, a child, a spouse, a sibling, a parent, but we also don't really need to know in order to understand the heartbreak of what we're seeing. The Christmas tree is such a potent symbol of joy and togetherness. It is the evergreen tree in the midst of winter, which we decorate for a festival of light in the darkest season. It is a celebration of family and connection, a time of gratitude and generosity. And so the mourner has built a little tree by the grave here, and decorated it with lights, and laid a wreath of holly on the snowy grave. Almost as though to say, you are not gone. You are still here with me, and we are having our Christmas. The mourner is attempting, as human beings so often do, to effect a resurrection, to bring the spirit of someone who is gone back to them, if only for a moment, and to honor them with love and remembrance. And it is so beautiful. Bright white snow under the canopy of the stars, evergreen bough with golden warm candles pushing back against the cold blue dark. Yes, the mourner is broken down in tears and sorrow because, try as we might, we cannot resurrect the dead. But is there anything more beautiful than the human capacity to love so deeply that we will try to do it all the same? Can you imagine doing this alone in the dark with nothing but the headstone of someone you love for company? Can you imagine what it must feel like to plant that tree and light those lights, not only remembering the times that they were there to light them with you, but also knowing that they will never be there again? It's almost too much. I feel the need to retreat from it, to put distance between me and what is being depicted. I want to critique this painting as a melodramatic emotionality, an obvious and overwrought play for the feelings. This is nothing more than cheap and shallow manipulation by a painter who's trying to cheat the audience into sympathizing with a work that isn't, on a technical level, even really that good. Look at that unfinished rendering, those smoky and indistinct outlines. Look at the flatness of the space and the primitivity of the composition. I want to create that distance because if I don't, if I engage with the painting emotionally, if I try to imagine myself into what is being shown, then it starts to hurt, and I feel vulnerable. And I remember that I too have people whose absence I feel on every Christmas Eve. So, let's move on from the uncomfortably and painfully literal to the abstract and the metaphorical. This is Oak Fractured by Lightning by Maxim Boroviev. Boroviev was a Russian landscape painter, and most of his output, at least that I could find, tends to look like this. Quiet, contemplative, in awe of nature. He seems like a placid romantic, a seeker of the serenity of nature, and not much for drama in his art. At least not until he paints this, an image of pandemonium. The subject of the picture is an oak, but where that oak is planted, only God can tell. The landscape around it is an unformed mess of jagged shapes over which the winds are beating in a way that suggests the spray of a raging ocean. The oak is at once planted in the ground and adrift in a storm, like some doomed and tragic sailing ship. And all of Boroviev's usual placidity of color and atmosphere is here replaced with screaming, violent contrast, dominated in the center by that single, deadly lightning strike. It flares up the sky and tears into the oak, splitting it apart like a matchstick. And the oak already wasn't doing so hot. Look at its branches, bent and twisted away from the beating winds and stripped naked of its leaves. You almost get the sense that if the lightning bolt hadn't cracked the tree, the wind would have stripped it bare and killed it by starvation. Vorobiev lost his wife suddenly in 1840 and painted this in 1842 while he was in the midst of a crippling depression and a mounting alcohol addiction. He himself called it an allegory for the death of his wife, and so the grief here is the feeling of being torn apart out of nowhere by forces you can scarcely comprehend and have no chance of resisting. Oak Fractured by Lightning is the polar opposite of Christmas Eve at the Grave. That painting was quiet, technically simple, flat in its colors, and entirely literal, while this is a loud, violent, technical masterpiece that exists entirely in abstraction. And yet, somehow, they are both paintings of the exact same thing. Now, we've looked at a lot of static art, we've looked at sculpture, and we have looked at a little tiny bit of animation, but what about sequential art? I'm on a bit of a One Piece kick right now. I made another video about it not long ago, and I recently reread the Marineford arc of that story, which, spoiler alert for something that happened at this point 13 years ago, features the death of Ace, the brother of the series protagonist, Luffy. It is one of the most heartbreaking moments in the series, and to this day, I cannot read this story without breaking into tears. But what I want to talk about here is how the comic handles depicting grief, how it uses its medium to communicate the emotional experience of that kind of loss and trauma. Now, the first thing to note about One Piece is that the comic's approach to emotion is caricature. While Eiichiro Oda and his team are more than capable of spectacular and naturalistic rendering, when it comes to moments of overpowering emotion, the tool they use is extreme exaggerations and caricature to communicate the intensity of the feelings at play. Mouths open many times beyond what's reasonable, teeth grow out to enormous sizes, and rivers of snot and tears pour forth from every crevice of distorted, quivering, rubber-like faces. But One Piece also uses its format, the comic, to heighten, contextualize, and temper the tone of the extreme emotions that it depicts. After the battle at Marineford, Luffy awakens from his injuries and goes on a wild rampage, lashing out in horror, rage, and sorrow. The comic intercuts the action with these gray-tinted traumatic flashback panels, which are assaulting our protagonist's senses. It cuts back and forth, snapping into the most violent moments with the literal sound effect of a gunshot or an explosion. He sees his own hand for just a moment, and then, boom, a vision of that hand covered in his brother's blood. By creating context between the images in this way, the comic puts us inside of Luffy's experience. When he experiences a flashback to this moment, so too do we. In this sense, comics are similar to filmmaking, which also has the power to create context through juxtaposition, but the difference between comics and film is time. The gutters between any two panels in a comic indicate the passage of time or a change in perspective, but where a movie allows us to see only one moment of a film at a time and only in a strict sequential order, a comic page can show a dozen or more moments on a page at a time and change their meaning and impact by playing with their shape, arrangement, and size. For example, in this sequence, Luffy is on a violent rampage, still reacting to the horrors that he's just been through. We open with this split panel of Luffy's lower head panting and bleeding, then this large and distant panel showing a tree getting smashed to pieces at the end of a trail of destruction, then a slightly smaller panel revealing the figure of Luffy, then this very narrow close-up on his bleeding hand, and this peculiar shot from the top down showing just part of Luffy's face. It's all kind of disjointed and scattered. The sequence of events is clear, but the perspective is quite literally all over the place. Then we get this huge panel, a moment of calm, as Luffy briefly imagines that maybe it was all a dream. Here the world literally revolves around him peacefully for a moment, and just like Luffy is having a moment of tranquility, so are we. A big, wide open panel lets us breathe, and that moment is extended with the next two panels that also just focus on our protagonist standing still and breathing. And then, pow! Literally, with the sound of a gunshot, a violent flashback shatters the peace of the moment, and now we're off to the races. The page cuts back and forth rapidly between Luffy screaming in pain and the memories that are assaulting him. The panels here are cluttered and dense, overlapped with word bubbles, snapping back and forth between extreme close-ups and long shots. We get this tiny panel where Luffy sees his own hand for a second, and then below, boom! A much larger panel where he sees that hand covered in his brother's blood. An extreme close-up on his face and an immediate push back out to look at the carnage from a distance. A medium shot of Luffy punching a rock, a POV shot from his memories of Ikanu's lethal fist, a close-up of his brother, a close-up of him, a close-up of his brother, and then, to give the audience a moment to breathe, the comic pulls the perspective out, focusing on the sheer scale of the carnage that Luffy is inflicting, because that bridges the gap as Jinbei enters the scene, and his presence and his perspective literally begins to stabilize the pace and composition and flow of the pages. So, not only is each individual panel communicating what is happening in each individual moment, but the layout and the connection between the panels on the page do part of the work of communicating the feelings of what's happening. Imagine if this exact same sequence of event was told through a series of splash pages that took up entire pages by themselves. Imagine how different the sense of time would be, and how much you would lose of that sense of overwhelming chaos that dominates these pages. All of this leads us to the moment of catharsis. The pages with Luffy's emotional chaos are dense, claustrophobic, and full of extreme close-ups and tiny panels and rapid cutting between perspectives. But as Jinbei speaks to him, calms him down, the camera angles begin to steady, the jumps in time and perspective get less extreme, and then eventually we land on this. The previous pages have all been dense with action, dense with extreme perspectives, detailed backgrounds, and lots of panels. And turning from that to this giant 2-page spread, which depicts only one singular moment in time, forces the pace of the storytelling to a complete stop. It is a moment of catharsis because it resolves the emotional tension of the narrative, but also because it gives you the absolute maximum amount of time and space that it can to stay in this one relieving moment. It is up to the reader how fast we turn the page and move on to see what's next, but the format of the comic is encouraging you as much as it can to, hey, slow down and take a second. And the way it does it is visually a little bit clever. Part of Luffy's suffering in these scenes is his inability to escape his memories. The horror and trauma of what he's been through forces itself violently into his perception, represented visually with the flashback panels that are constantly inserting themselves onto the pages, interrupting Luffy's own perception and his continuity. When Luffy thinks of his crew, though, his friends, they also appear in panels, visual representations of Luffy's memory of them, just like the flashbacks, but they don't interrupt him, or overwhelm him, or overlap him, or flash up suddenly like a jump scare. They simply replace the background behind him, appearing like family photos on a wall. In this moment, visually, his crew are his world, and their memories are acting as a steadying background rather than fighting with him for control. One Piece's extreme caricature always runs the risk of being seen as comical when it's meant to be taken seriously. When characters' faces distort and distend like this, it is hard not to see it through the lens of cartoon farce. Like, look at Luffy's face here as he's dissolving fully into his hurt. These are, objectively speaking, very funny drawings, and the balancing act of keeping the tone somber while still using these extreme cartoony caricatures is carried by the format of the comic. The intercutting, the flashbacks, the deliberate act of putting you inside Luffy's perspective to see why he's making these extreme faces. These are the things that strike the balance. These are what keeps the caricatured aesthetic from undercutting the tone or the emotionality of its narrative. The pietas and the paintings we've looked at previously all depict grief in very different ways, but they also all have something particular in common, which is dignity. Whether it's the immaculate posturing of Mary cradling Jesus, the natural magnificence of a lightning bolt cleaving an oak in two, or the quiet stateliness of a woman in mourning, they all show the subject of grief from a position of what I would call a kind of reverence, a sense that these things are too significant and weighty to make light of or to point out absurdities in. These depictions are definitely emotionally affecting, but I think they do miss out a little bit on honesty, because they stop shy of ever depicting grief as truly ugly. Which is part of what I find so compelling about how One Piece and Arcane handles these emotions. Feelings of grief, especially when they are raw, can be brutal, and more often than not, they do not look pretty. And I don't mean this to suggest that One Piece or Arcane are the superior depictions of grief. There's no such thing. This is all opinion, feeling, and interpretation. It's not science. Grief is often loud and ugly, but it can also be quiet and internal. Stoic mourning is the social norm that many of us follow, and Cramsoy's Inconsolable Grief does a much better job of depicting that than any panel in One Piece that I can think of. And grief can be, in its way, beautiful, because grief is evidence of love, and few pictures on Earth capture that quite as vividly as Hesselbaum's Christmas Eve at the grave. Anyway, I don't think I have a coda or a strong conclusion for this video, because it really was just an excuse to talk about some art that I like. As I'm writing this, it is the end of August, and I am not having a good time. I'm in the process of getting diagnosed for ADHD because the symptoms of that condition have started severely interfering with my life. Or rather, if I'm being honest, it has been severely interfering with me for a while, and I've been unwilling to admit it. And there have been large unexpected expenses recently, and there's been a lot of work stress. I haven't gotten to see my family much, and my friends even less. It's a low period. And when I feel low, I tend to seek out sad media. It's why I ended up rereading the saddest parts of One Piece just to feel something, and it's the kind of mood that will have me watching compilations of all the saddest moments from children's movies on YouTube, or rewatching Grave of the Fireflies. But the thing that sparked me to write this video was something on TikTok, actually, which seems to have figured out that sad, emotional artwork is exactly the thing my soul is craving right now. One of the things it showed me was from an art history account I follow. It was a slideshow titled something along the lines of Saddest Paintings in Art History, or whatever. That slideshow contained Cramsoy's Inconsolable Grief, along with some copy-pasted biographical details about the man who painted it. but it also contained this. This is Anguish by August Friedrich Schenk. Schenk was a Danish-born, French-German romantic painter who worked in Paris for most of his life, which is a little bit of a European mouthful of a character. He was a landscape painter, but he also made a brisk trade in paintings of animals, which he rendered with genuinely spectacular technical skill. Even in his time, Schenk's work was considered, well, kind of schmaltzy, frankly. It was a little bit kitsch. He painted the sort of pictures that nowadays we associate with cute kitten calendars or cheap porcelain knickknacks that decorate the mantelpiece of your grandma's house. He traded in excessively sumptuous nature scenes, lots of rural idyll, and lots of very pretty animals. Schenk, though, seems to have been especially fond of sheep, which feature in quite a lot of his works, and he seems to use them as representations of vulnerability and innocence. He liked to paint flocks of sheep in blizzards and snowstorms and frozen landscapes, or facing some sort of peril, presumably as a way to tug on the audience's heartstrings, or possibly to express some religious sentiments, shepherds and sheep flocks and the Lamb of God and so forth. Anguish, though, is by far his most famous work, and by far the most well-documented and most extensively written about. And I can see why. On a purely technical level, this is an amazing piece of work. The wool on the ewe and her lamb is rendered with incredible attention to texture and pattern. It almost looks as though you could reach out and touch it. And the frozen white tips on the coat of the ewe, together with that obvious biting wind that's pulling at her coat, do a fantastic job of showing just how bitter and cold the environment must be. There's also some interesting storytelling going on here, because when you look closer at the snow, you see that it is full of hoof prints. What it looks like is that an entire flock of sheep went through here, leaving the ewe and her dead lamb behind. And depending on how you want to interpret it, there's a suggestion of a horrible possibility here. The snow is so chaotic and disturbed and kicked up, it almost looks like a stampede has happened. And looking at the way that the blood seems to have sprayed from the lamb's mouth, I can't help but think, did it get kicked in the head? Did something spook the flock and they bolted and this little guy just got caught in it? Trampled to death by his own family? It's a reading that makes the scene even more heartbreakingly awful, although the painting is already plenty heartbreaking without it. The thing that makes the tragedy hit for me, the thing that really gets me, is that one leg stepped protectively over the lamb's body. She's warding off the crows that have come for the carrion, refusing to let them near her child, and in that gesture, what I see, at least, is the desperate denial that follows a sudden tragedy. What I see is that panicked, manic disbelief that this has not happened. My lamb isn't dead. He just fell. He just got knocked over. He fell and he's going to get back up any second now. If I just protect him a little longer, he's going to get back up. This hasn't happened. He hasn't died. This is why the crows are there in the image. They are carrion birds and commonly used as symbols and representations of death. The lamb is already theirs, and they will collect it, no matter how much its mother cries in protest. And that's also why there are so many of them. A single bird would have been enough to symbolize the presence of death, but that's not all that they are here for. They also represent the truth. The ewe is in denial, but the truth is pressing in. It is surrounding her, crowding her, and it becomes more and more overwhelming with every second that passes as more and more crows arrive. The child is already theirs, because the child is dead. This is a brutal painting, but not at all a cynical one, I think. The painting represents the tragic inevitability of the truth, but in struggling against it, the mother is not portrayed as foolish. If anything, standing on that slight crested hill, rising above the mob of crows with the golden light of sun shining on her face and crying her pain to the wind, more than anything, it looks heroic. Her child is dead, and it will be food for the crows, but when she fights them back, even so, I understand why. because it's the exact same reason why Hisselbaum's mourner builds a Christmas tree in that graveyard. However futile it might be, love always tries to reach beyond the veil of death. I'm sure this kind of painting doesn't work on everybody. We all have different things that get to us, and maybe it leaves you cold. Maybe its emotional manipulations are a little bit too obvious and crude for you. But for me, with the mood that I've been in, when I saw this painting, it got to me. It showed me something which, for all its melodrama and unsubtle animal metaphor, it showed me something which I feel is true. And the irony is not lost on me that I opened this video by criticizing pietas for being too inhuman in their depictions of grief. But the reason I'm making this video in the first place is because I was deeply affected by a pieta whose figures aren't human at all. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you had fun. I don't know if this video is very fun. Like I said, I don't have much of a larger reason for making this one. I have just been in a mood, and I wanted to talk about some art that affected me. But if you've enjoyed this video, or if you found it interesting at least, you can reward me by hitting like or subscribing and, so on and so on. If you want to help me out a little bit more than that, well, I do take donations. If you have $1 that you don't need for yourself, then if you want to, you can support the channel via Patreon, or you can do a one-time donation via Ko-fi. That will get you early access to my videos and a few other perks if you're interested. A $1 donation directly to a creator equals the ad revenue of thousands of views on a video, so even small donations make a disproportionately huge difference. If you have a content creator whose work you enjoy, whether it's me or someone else, please consider donating to them when you can with whatever you can. I do want to stress, though, that I don't want any money that you need for yourself. It is more than enough that you've watched the video this far. Anyway, that is all the self-promotion I have for you. If you have stuck with the video this far, put a art emoji in the comments down below, like a pencil or a pen or a palette or a painting, and I will leave a little heart on it. Thank you very much for your time and your attention. Remember to be kind to one another. Have solidarity with those who are worse off than yourselves. And may the tides of history wash gently over us all.